as far as Indiana right now, they've got guys like Malik and I'm going to count Xavier, Caleb, and CJ. Three of the four freshmen are coming back. We expect all back, but and those are the type of guys that are going to be needed, and Indiana's going to have to cycle through this. How quickly do you think that they can cycle in through the portal? Because this is it's still new it's new to everybody, but it's even newer to Mike Woodson because he's just still new to the college game. I know he's through 2 years of this, and it probably doesn't take that long to get used to the portal, but Indiana has not hit home runs in the portal just yet.
Well, I don't know if they haven't hit. I mean, Xavier Johnson's a pretty good portal pickup. I mean, he had the third most assists in a single season in Indiana history in 2022. I mean, listen, I don't think anybody's got a perfect formula for the portal. I think that and really, I think it's less about the portal and it's more just about the more fundamental idea of how do you do transfers. We weren't calling it the portal era yet when Terry Morin was making really solid use of transfers like Ali Patberg and Brenna Wise and finding, Nicole Cardano-Hillary, finding players that really just sort of fit needs she had, fit her locker room culture, fit her playing and coaching style. And we were just saying, well, gee, Terry has, some real success with transfers. We weren't calling it the portal era yet when that kind of really took shape. And I think it's more just about, can you build a healthy structure around it? And there are people who say that, Mike Woodson has an advantage because he was in the NBA. And that's probably true to some extent, that the idea of, free agency and, almost just sort of the understanding that like nothing is really forever. And obviously nothing's forever in college, but according to the old way of thinking in college, you would recruit a kid, you'd sign him, and you'd think, okay, he's mine for the next 4 to 5 years. So I'm planning this in cycles, and this is where he's going to fit at this point, and then this point, and then this point. In the NBA, it is a lot more sort of like, well, there's going to be a core group that we think will be around for a while, but we're going to have to build around that group. Some of that's going to be through the draft. So that's going to be young players that aren't going to be the fully finished product. We're going to need to develop them. We're going to need to identify them and figure out that they have the right skills and the right temperament. And then we're going to need to bring them along once we get them. Some of that's going to be through free agency. We're going to go sign guys that are, maybe on 1-2 year deals and hope they come in and prove something. So there's a world where I think Mike Woodson is more comfortable, just operating in that way. But I just think it's about, can you be aggressive? Can you really like kind of give guys a sense of what you need from them and how they'll fit. And then there's other factors too. Indiana's position in NIL, I think, is going to help them in the portal. I think I'm confident in saying there are comfortably 7 figures worth of NIL earnings on Indiana's current, let's say, outgoing roster, the roster that is about to turn over. My understanding from talking to people outside Indiana, outside, frankly, the Big Ten, but just maybe more knowledgeable about NIL more widely, is that Indiana probably has one of the better NIL setups in the country in terms of resources and opportunities on the men's basketball side. And that makes a big difference when you are going to a guy that's maybe got 2 years left and, he's getting called by, he's narrowing it down to 5, 6, 7 high major programs. And he's telling you, he likes what you're talking about. And he just wants to know that he's going to have the opportunities that maybe are going to make the most of those last couple of years. That makes a difference too. And so there's just a lot of factors that go into it. And I think Indiana's probably pretty well positioned to be aggressive in the portal, but you got to go make the most of it. And that's just the way it is.
Absolutely. And are Indiana fans going to have to get used to instead of the guys that they've been used to seeing, players that are potentially just going to be 1 to 2 year max as being the quote unquote stars of their future teams.
I mean, that's possible. I think that certainly at very least it's going to be a blend. I think there's just an extent to which you are going to have to be comfortable in modern college basketball with a blend of these two things. And if you can, in the same way that for a long time we've said you got to be comfortable with if you want to operate at an elite level, you got to be comfortable with the fact that sometimes you're going to have teams built around guys that only be there for a year. Because they go to the draft. I mean, I'm talking about like one and done high school recruits. That's just part of it, I think. And ultimately it's like anything else. You got to get your evals right. You got to build strong relationships. You've got to be consistent with, your values and everything. And I think that Indiana, again, if you look at like this roster, for example, let's assume Xavier Johnson gets his year back. There's, I think, a pretty good chance that Indiana's starting at least a couple transfers next year. But then Indiana's also probably starting Malik Renew, who is a high school recruit that was, brought in and developed and, kind of, positioned as, I don't say the heir apparent to Trayce Jackson-Davis, because I think he's a different player, and I think Indiana's going to use him different ways. But certainly sort of the next key post player. You wouldn't have to work very hard to convince me, obviously, that Trey Galloway's still in the starting lineup. You wouldn't even necessarily have to work very hard to convince me that maybe like a player like Caleb Banks could make a jump and land in the starting lineup. And so my point is, it's always going to be part of it, and people have to be comfortable with it. For a coach, you've just got to make sure you get your balance right, and that ultimately, like I said, your evals and your needs meet what you are doing, meet what you're looking for from a culture perspective as well as a skills perspective.
And as Mike Woodson has come into this, it's changed as he's gotten here. So it's probably an advantage for him to have come in from the NBA and it been one way for 2 or 3 years and then changed. It changed kind of as he got here, which has probably been a big help for him because it's closer to the NBA setup now as far as getting players. But does this allow him to make quicker changes and get this program into the shape that he wants to see it in, his style, as opposed to now having to play guys that are kind of, I don't want to use the word leftover, but have come from the previous regime, and it's just he seems to have been forced to play a style that is not one that he wants.
Yeah, I mean, he's said at times, and I think we sometimes heard this, and because we were sort of talking about the immediacy of, or writing about how great Trayce Jackson-Davis was tonight or something like that, we'd hear it, but we wouldn't really process it maybe. But I mean, he said it again after the Miami game that, he's never really built a team around he has never really built a team around a high usage post player like Trayce Jackson-Davis, around a center like Trayce Jackson-Davis. And I think that's interesting because, again, we're talking about a coach who, if you look at his time in the NBA, and I wrote this week, lots of people want to think about Mike Woodson through the lens of what he did with the Knicks. I think when you're talking about what he's going to need to do at the college level, I think it's a lot more relevant to talk about what he did with the Hawks, because he built that team up from scratch. And that team was long, rangy, athletic, interchangeable. that team by its peak had lineups that included Joe Johnson, Josh Smith, Josh Childress, Al Horford, Marvin Williams, Mario West, Mo Evans, players that were somewhere between 6'6" and 6'9", with plus wingspans that could play 3, if not 4 different positions on the floor at any given time. It was the sort of thing that Woodson saw Larry Brown do with the Pistons. And Woodson never really had a high usage center in Atlanta. Al Horford was basically his best center, and Horford is obviously not a center. He's a stretch four. He's a power forward. And I was thinking about this while I was riding yesterday because I grew up a Hawks fan, so I was kind of digging back into the recesses of my mind for some of this. The most high-profile center I can remember Mike Woodson pursuing when he was in Atlanta was Stromile Swift, who went to LSU, who was, I think, 6'9" with a 7-foot wingspan. He was a shot blocker, rebounder, rim runner, screen setter. Woodson never built a team that ran its offense through the post. And I think he did that the last 2 years because he recognized how good Trayce Jackson-Davis was. And to be fair to Woodson and Trayce Jackson-Davis, both Trayce Jackson-Davis became such a remarkably adept player at it that it stopped just being sort of the normal stodgy old post offense and started being something that could be very dynamic because of Jackson-Davis' ability to take the ball at the key and drive, because of his ability to pass and skip and beat the double team. But I don't think that's something Mike Woodson will do again, to be honest with you. And so while I'm not saying Mike Woodson walked into his office, Monday morning or Tuesday morning, because I think they didn't leave Albany until Monday morning. I'm not saying he walked into his office Tuesday morning and said, I'm finally free. I can do what I want. I think he's going to miss Trayce Jackson-Davis tremendously. But there's kind of been this discussion of Indiana's losing all this production, and people give you the numbers, the points, the rebounds, the minutes played, the usage percentage, and things like that. And they say, well, how are you going to replace all that? And the answer is, I think Indiana is going to replace it by doing something completely different. I think that, people who see that, they need to break themselves of the old mold that says basically the system as it's currently constituted is what's going to be there again next year. And Indiana's got to figure out a way to put a whole bunch of new players into those roles and get the same sort of production out of those players. I think Indiana's going to do something, or try to do something anyway, very, very different structurally. And I'm not saying it's going to work. Are they going to make the tournament? We'll see. They've got a lot of work to do in the portal, certainly. But I think that just broadly speaking, Indiana it's impossible for me to sit here and say how good Indiana is going to be next year, not just because the personnel is an incomplete sort of canvas right now, but also because I don't think Indiana is going to play very much at all the way next year, the way it has played the last 2 years.